Okay, so chapter one. The chapters in this book, the ecology book, are divided into separate concepts. And so I've got a page over on the side here for each concept. The first concept is that life is connected and that no organism lives in isolation. It depends on other organisms, other organisms as sources of food. Um, Talk later about mutualisms, where organisms depend on each other for survival. And of course, you have other organisms as your sources of food, and in some cases, there are organisms that want to eat you. So there are all sorts of ways that the living world is connected. We start with a discussion of amphibians and the observation that amphibians have been in decline for a while now. That is, the number of extinct species is fairly high, and the number of threatened or endangered species is fairly high in different parts of the world and has been increasing. So, of course, from that observation, the question is, well, why are amphibians having a hard time of it? The first hypothesis that's discussed is, and backing up for a second, it's thought that amphibians are what are called indicator species. That is, they indicate some sort of problem with their habitat, with their surroundings, the natural world. Okay, so first hypothesis has to do with a parasite. That is this organism called, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but Riberiori or Riberiora. And it has an interesting life cycle. Speaking of connections and interactions, it spends part of its early stages in this type of snail, then in the amphibian, and then in a bird. And it just spends different stages of its life cycle in different organisms, cycling between them. And so it's thought that maybe these parasites, and so a lab experiment was carried out, and in it they had different groups of tadpoles. Some of the tadpoles had no parasites basically on them. Others, there were 16 that were put on them, and 32 and 48. And so you can see when they didn't have parasites, essentially the frogs had no deformities, and they had really high survival rate. Whereas as the number of parasites increased, survivorship came down, and the number of deformities increased. So that experiment kind of shows that these parasites definitely have an effect on these young frogs, these tadpoles. All right, so the question is then, are there other factors involved? And here's a field experiment in which they raise these frogs outside in natural habitat, but in these enclosed pens. And the pens came in different mesh sizes. The smaller mesh size keeps the parasites out, whereas the larger one lets them in. And they thought, well, is there something else involved? So it's known that through agriculture, pesticides can get into water, and so it's thought, well, what role do pesticides perhaps play? And so in two of the four treatments here, the ones on the top, you can see there was no pesticide, and the two on the bottom, there is pesticide present. Well, when you have the small mesh size, no pesticide, no frog deformities, pesticides present, no frog deformities. Okay, so it looks like pesticides don't play a role in deformities. But when we have the larger mesh size, the size that lets the parasite through, we can see in the absence of pesticides, we get some, but not many of the frogs with deformities. But now when we have parasite present and pesticide present, you can see that the percent of deformities goes up significantly. These deformities often involve having extra legs. So it looks like not only having the parasite present, but having the pesticide present also causes problems and makes things worse. Well, why is that? Well, when you look at these tadpoles and these frogs, and here's an experiment in which there was a control group that received no treatment. There was a group that were, then the rest of the groups were exposed to pesticides. But in one, there was what's called the solvent control. The solvent breaks the pesticide down, so it basically is not apparently a problem for the tadpoles and frogs. Then there was a treatment with low pesticide and high pesticide. And the treatments are the same up here in this bar graph. So you can see in the control and solvent control, white blood cell counts, these things called eosinophils, are relatively high. Whereas in the treatments with low and high pesticides, you can see that the number of white blood cells is down. And you can see the cysts. The cysts are what form when the parasite is infecting its host. And so you can see the number of cysts, or essentially parasites, are much higher in the presence of the pesticides. So this suggests, again, doesn't really prove, but suggests that the pesticides lower the white blood cell count and make them more susceptible to the parasite. Of course, the white blood cells are what are involved with fighting off pathogens and other infections and parasites and such like that. So it appears, and this work suggests that things that people do, in this case allowing pesticides to get into water, has an effect on this other species. And in many cases, the things we do can affect natural systems and can affect ourselves and our own health. You've probably heard of West Nile virus. It was brought to this country and is transmitted by mosquitoes. And you can see it first arrived back in 1999 in New York, and it has spread throughout the country. Only recently, as you can see, getting up into Maine, it was the last state to be impacted by this, for most people, relatively benign disease, but in some folks, it can cause a problem. And obviously, it causes a problem in birds because it can kill them. Okay, concept 2, what is ecology? So we talked about this in class a little bit the other day, and we sort of summarized it as the study of natural organisms in the environment, natural systems, and the interactions that occur between these organisms. We've contrasted this a little bit with environmental science, which you could describe as a field within ecology where we look at the effects that human actions have, that people have on natural systems. The book mentions that early on, ecologists thought of natural systems as being somewhat fixed and in balance. But through many years of study, we know, of course, that systems can change over time, and that it was also thought that there was, again, sort of a fixed endpoint for a natural system. That is, if you modify the system, it would sort of work its way back to what it was supposed to be. But we now know that's not always the case, and that human actions, disturbance, these things can change these systems enough such that they really don't return to the way they were. Not always. I mean, that they do sometimes for sure, but not always. Okay, and so the book points out what it calls these ecological maxims, these principles of ecology. And as we've sort of been alluding to, you can never do just one thing. If you cause a change in the system, it's not just going to affect one part of that system or one thing. It'll tend to affect many parts of that system. And there really is, as we say, no away. Things just don't go away. When, in an environmental science sense, when your trash leaves your house, it's not gone, it just goes somewhere else. And it's the same in natural systems. When organisms die, they don't just disappear, they decay, and the atoms and compounds in them end up in organisms or up in the atmosphere or something like that. They just don't disappear. You can think here sort of the law of conservation of matter. Stuff does not disappear. we're going to study populations later, we'll see that populations just don't continuously grow. They reach, as we'll see, what's called a carrying capacity. Um, and that carrying capacity is that sort of limit to the size of the population is typically due to the resources that are available because they tend to be limiting, so the population size will be limited. There's no free lunch. We're going to talk, particularly when we talk about ecosystems with energy. And of course, energy is in a fixed amount. There's not an infinite amount. And the laws of thermodynamics, as we'll get to later, dictate how energy is used. And so we'll see that when organisms consume something and get energy from the foods they consume, they only make use of a relatively small proportion of that energy. A lot of it is lost as wasted energy. And so that tends to limit the growth of an individual, the growth of the population, this limited amount of energy. Okay, what else? Evolution, we'll talk about that. It's an important process for living systems. It is the process by which species change over time, typically relatively slowly, but the rate can vary somewhat. So time is important. We'll talk about temporal or time-based factors that determine how organisms change over time. Space matter, that is, spatial factors can control and limit populations. And again, these species interactions are extremely important. You, of course, interact with other organisms when you're eating. You have other organisms, primarily, well, bacteria that live inside you, inside your gut, that are extremely important for your digestion and nutrition. And as we said just above, scale is important when we study ecology. And we can look at different scales, different size pieces of the landscape, if you will. So you could focus on a single organism if you want. Now, of course, you're not going to really be able to answer many questions looking at a single organism, but you can study that organism's ecology. You're able to have more power and answer more questions when you look at populations, because you can get an average for how a particular organism reacts to certain changes in the conditions. You can study that population over time to see if, for example, that population is increasing or decreasing. We can also look at communities, groups of different species interacting with each other, and how they interact with each other, how they affect each other. We can look at, ecosystems, which are systems, ecological systems, where we look at not only the biotic or living factors, but the abiotic factors, the non-living factors, and how these factors sort of impact each other. How do living things change the abiotic conditions? How do they change the soil, for example? And then how do those changes perhaps affect those organisms and other organisms in that system? Another level, it's sort of the next level up, is what's called landscapes. Relatively large areas of land that can often have multiple types of ecosystems. And then sort of at the largest scale, we have the biosphere, which is the area of Earth, at the surface of the Earth for the most part, where living things are found. Okay. So, when we study connections in nature, we look at different characteristics of organisms. Of course, organisms are, I'm about to run out of time. I'm going to stop here and start another video.